Welcome to In Touch. I'm Lucy Sondels. My guest today is David Rodich, as you probably guessed by seeing the video that we just saw. Take me out to the ball game. Is that the right title for that piece of video?
Well, that scene that we saw in our opening is of the Old Time Ball Players Club of Wadsworth. These are people who would have played ball actively probably in the 1880s and early 1890s. And they were what you might call a senior league. This film was taken in 1941 of them gathered down at the AC Field on College Street. And we looked at this first picture the last time we were together. Sometimes, unfortunately, because of the way things are set up and because of time constraints, we can't always go through and name everyone that we'd like to, and of course we don't have names for everyone. But this picture was taken just after the turn of the century, and it shows the old-time ball players of that day. Now, these would have been people who would have played ball in the late 60s, I mean 1860s, 70s, and 80s. And we see Dr. Wookter and George Chandler and Harry Mills and a number of the other people who were quite active in town around that time. Tom Cale over here on this side, and still a lot of recognizable figures today. Now, the next photograph that we have was taken in 1939, which of course is more contemporary with the film that we saw in our opening. And this was one of the celebrations, or part of the celebration, that was had in conjunction with the 125th anniversary of Wadsworth. It is also taken down at the AC Field. You see the scoreboard in the background, which was donated by the Wadsworth Merchants and the Wadsworth Eagles. And these men, some of them were still active. You see a few of them still have baseball uniforms on, though some of them were beyond their prime. The only one whose face I can make out clearly is Raleigh Reichard in the background. But these men were people who would have been active playing ball around the turn of the century. And they did continue to have regular active ball games, even though they were the older generation. They did play actively. Now, one other thing that we might correct from our last show is I say sometimes I get going too quickly, and my cue card person just doesn't keep up with me. I guess that's the problem.
Yeah, that's right.
But we were mentioning the Lions Club as they sang on the bandstand in downtown Wadsworth, the old stone bandstand, and I pointed out Dr. McRitchie and Charlie Bixler and Ira Shoup. But I missed Mr. Daly, Howard Daly, who was the head of the City Loan, and of course Rod Lonier. And now the name of the other officer just slipped my mind. So this may come back a third time. We're going to keep doing this.
We're going to send out quizzes
till we do it right.
Well, we had talked last time about a lot of civic groups and organizations in town, and really weren't quite through with all the many variety of activities that Wadsworth has to offer.
That's right. And as I did point out previously, we are going to try and stay away from groups that are musically oriented, so that we can save those for a separate program. But there were a lot that were involved, that did get together for recreational purposes. And this next photograph is one of those organizations. Now, this is the Wadsworth Motorcycle Club, and they're coming from College Street. In case you can't quite get your bearings there, this is College Street heading towards the square on the south side of College Street. This building that you see in the background was the private hospital for Dr. C.A. Bolick. His home is behind this house that's part of the float. And this was his private hospital, and for many years it was the only hospital between Akron and Galion, Ohio. So it was quite important to the community until our local municipal hospital was built. And this building is now occupied by Larry Luck for his law offices. It's been refronted, but if you look at the roof, you can see the same slate roof. So that gives you some indication of where they're moving. You have the restaurant here in the corner, which would be about where the drive-through for the Bank One is, or the H&R Block Company. And as I say, they're moving towards the square. We have another photograph of the Wadsworth Motorcycle Club.
Somehow I think of these motorcycle clubs as occurring in the 50s, you know, with James Dean and that.
Well, actually, they were very popular from the beginning, and it's a little bit difficult to make out in this picture, but if you looked at it closely, you could see there are just about as many women in the picture as men, because men would take their wives or their best girls along with them in the sidecars. And they're lined up in front of the Lutheran Church. That's Grace Lutheran, of course, in the background, and the old carriage factory where the car wash is now. And this was done, I believe, on a Sunday morning as they were preparing to go out on one of their trips through the countryside. Now, on the site, the parking lot behind Picket Fence Floral, I have to be careful. I used last week in identifying to someone a location, I referred to the Christian bookstore on Main Street, and from the time I told the person until he got down to look at what I meant, it was gone. But in any case, the parking lot behind Picket Fence, there was a building that was long known as the Park Barber Shop, or Crook and Jackson's Barber Shop, and it had been used previously as a motorcycle shop, which was run by Glenn Durling. And Glenn Durling was the president of the Wadsworth Motorcycle Club in 1918, which is around the same time that this photograph would have been taken.
Oh, my.
Now, we saw a picture also the last time we were together of the Wadsworth businessmen out at Young's Hotel, out at the lakes, and they were having a businessmen and women's picnic, because as we pointed out, there were some business women in the picture also. But even previous to that, the businessmen were organized before the turn of the century. And this was a businessman's picnic, probably about 1905, I would guess, maybe a little bit previous to that. And in those days, the entire community would close down. All the stores would close down, the factories, everything would shut down. And people would pack their picnic baskets, and we see a large number of picnic baskets and hampers in the foreground. And they would board an excursion train and go to Cedar Point for the day, or to Silver Lake, or to one of the other resort areas around this part of Ohio, and spend the entire day. And as I said, the whole town would go, but it was sponsored by the businessmen.
Well, what's fun?
Now, this little booklet announces 20 years in service for the YMCA. Now, that's the YMCA in Medina County. It was organized here in 1907, and this was at their 25th anniversary. One of the leading people behind this movement was Dr. N.S. Everhard.
No, and I have the right picture.
Nope, there we go, just happened to open to it. That's Dr. N.S. Everhard, who, as we have pointed out before, was not only a physician, but one of the founders of the Ohio companies. And though he and Mrs. Everhard had no children, they would oftentimes take young boys into their home and raise them and educate them into some profession. And so, of course, this was something that was quite of great interest to him. And he and Dr. C.B. Etter, the pastor of the Lutheran Church, were instrumental in organizing this YMCA in Medina County. The next photograph we have is a picture from about 1907, 1908, in front of the Grace Lutheran Church, the old Grace Lutheran Church. And you see a number of the original members of that YMCA. Dr. Etter, to whom I referred a moment ago, is in the center, in the background. And in shows through the years, we've pointed out a fellow named George Wuchter, who always seems to get into photographs. And I just wanted to let you know, George Wuchter didn't miss.
I didn't miss this one.
He's in that picture there. But there are many, many well-known people, young men of the community in that picture. George Wuchter, incidentally, was a member of the class of 1907, so that gives you some indication of the date of the photograph. This fellow right here in the center is Clyde Opplinger. And within a very short while, he would be instrumental using the knowledge that he got from the YMCA to start the first Boy Scout troops here in Wadsworth.
I see.
He was also a talented musician.
Was the Y at this time recreational exclusively, or did they have other?
It was, you might almost say, along the lines of the Boy Scouts, as far as teaching camping and things of this nature. But it wasn't... there was no place to swim, nothing of that nature available, but they would take motor trips. And because of Dr. Everhard's wealth, he was able to finance a lot of these trips to different areas, educational trips and things of that nature.
I just was curious.
Something along the lines of a boys' club, I guess you might say. Of course, the YMCA in Medina County continues to operate. Now, this poor, broken, battered picture, the photograph itself is in good condition, but it's been broken and battered many times. This is the Campfire Girls, who would be the counterpart to the YMCA for the boys. Of course, we have the YWCA, but at that time it was not organized as such. Marguerite Kramer-Straighten, who we've talked about previously as being a leader in many of the women's organizations in town, is in the center. This would have been taken about 1911, 1910, in through that area. And by 1915, they had 5 fires burning, meaning that there were 5 little groups, or you wouldn't call them dens exactly, but 5 little groups organized within the Campfire Girls in Wadsworth.
Did you imagine that they're doing a pageant here of some sort, that they're in dress, or is...
That, every picture that I have seen of the organization here in Wadsworth, in the old, these pictures such as this would appear in the high school yearbooks. And
they were all dressed like this?
They were dressed like that. That was their, just as we think of the Boy Scouts in their type of uniform. That I would hate to think they had to dress like that for every single meeting
or whatever.
but they are pretending to be drawing back bows.
actually a wonderful costume.
Some of the other organizations that another organization that we had for people who lived a little further out of town at that time. Now, this is of a little later vintage, this program, but this is of the Farmers Institute. And of course, Wadsworth and Medina County being primarily agricultural in nature, farmers were very important to us. And so we did have the Grange organized. Of course, we have the Grange Hall out in Guilford, and there's still many of those organizations are very active. 4-H, very active. But this was another organization yet. What we tried to point out in our last show was that no matter what your interest, there was a group for you. You belonged somewhere. And this was for the Farmers Institute. They were holding a program at the centralized school, which is what we would now call Isham, in 1939. And they had quite an elaborate program there of songs and dances and recitations and speeches and things of that nature.
So it's not necessarily geared towards, how to raise your animals, because they already knew it.
Right. It wasn't so much just along the 4-H lines where you have a project and follow it through. But it was also, exactly, it was an opportunity for them to expand their horizons, I guess you would say. Now, this photograph, I think you
pull the
might
clipboard
need
again
this
here? Yeah.
for that, because unfortunately I was short of frame. Now, this technically is not an organizational picture. It's not a particular club, but it's important because it showed the close-knit community that existed here at that time. What they are doing is celebrating the 90th birthday of Emma Wassell, who was the lady at the head of the table. And so her daughter, Mrs. Paul Bennell, hosted a mother-daughter banquet. And around the table is Mrs. J.B. Irwin, who was the mother of Linford Irwin, longtime bank president. J.B. Irwin was also associated with the banks. Next to her is Mrs. L.F. Long. Next to her is Clara Wells. Next to her is Mrs. G.H., I almost missed it, Miss G.H. Fale, who was the mother of Ike Fale, longtime Wadsworth druggist. As I mentioned, Mrs. Bennell and Mrs. Wassell. Over on the other side is Mrs. Worthington. Next to her is Mrs. A.J. Crable. Next to her is Mrs. I.H. Fale, who was the wife of Ike Fale, and the mother of Bob Fale, who just passed away a short time ago. And just out of the picture is,
You'll probably think of it at 3 this morning.
It'll
tomorrow
come
morning.
to me in a second.
Yeah. Well, she's out of the picture.
Mrs. H.C. Dibble. Mrs. H.C. Dibble. Now, as we mentioned, of course, Mrs. Wassell was the mother of Mrs. Bennell. Mrs. Wells was the mother of Mrs. Long, and our elusive Mrs. Dibble. And Mrs. Fale is the mother-in-law of Mrs. Ike Fale. And Mrs. Worthington is the mother of Mrs. Irwin. So it was a mother-daughter party.
That's pretty impressive to even know the in-law connections, David.
That I remembered. I forget the lady I know.
Well, she didn't have a face, so it would be hard to figure out who she was.
Now, Wadsworth at this time, garden clubs are very important here because they keep our community beautiful. And they were always very much interested in flower shows. They had flower shows from a very early time. And these were held originally in the social room of or the community room as it was called, of the Citizens Bank, or the Wadsworth Savings and Trust Company here in Wadsworth. At that time, our First National Bank on Main Street, which is now the Acres Insurance Agency, was built in 1925. The Wadsworth Savings and Trust building on the corner was built in 1930. And both of these contained community rooms. Because as we just said a moment ago with the Farmers Institute, a lot of our population were farming people. And they couldn't easily get away from their chores on the farm to come into town at just any time. So when they came to town, usually on a Saturday evening, it was a big occasion for them. And so it was necessary to have some type of social room where they could gather together and the farmers could discuss prices and things of this nature. Now, an interesting fact about the Acres Insurance Building, they also had a mezzanine where the ladies were supposed to go, a ladies' waiting room, while the men were either discussing important things like farming or transacting business. And ladies were considered too, even in 1925 when that building was built, were considered too genteel to really involve themselves with such things, mundane things as handling money. which probably led to the Depression. If we'd let the ladies handle money, perhaps we would have been in better shape at that time. But in any case, the flower shows were often held in the bank social rooms. And this picture that we have here, oh, I'm sorry, I beg your pardon. If we can go to this one first. This one predates that.
Which one?
The top two.
The top two. Okay.
This is of the garden club shows in 1937. And you say, well, they seem like they're all sitting around. They're not looking at flowers. Well, in addition to the displays of flowers, they also had bridge parties. And so you see a number of the ladies seated around playing bridge, and this was also used as a fundraiser to help fund the organization. In the second picture down below, we have Mrs. Porter Baird and Mrs. Ted Ewing and Mrs. Paul Wolford, and with her back to the camera is Mrs. Glenn Freeborn. But they were involved in a bridge game at that 1937 flower show. And we do have some black and white photographs of those early flower shows, and unfortunately they don't come close to matching the newspaper descriptions of how beautiful they were. Also, local jeweler J.W. Stonier was very much involved in aiding the flower show movement, and oftentimes these would be displayed in his jewelry store as well as kind of a preamble to the actual show. The next picture that we have is of the 1939 garden show, and this is when it was again in the bank building. I think this one was in the bank building. They also used drums at City Hall, and I think this was in the bank. You notice a bird cage up there.
Yeah, this reminds me of like the home and flower show you'd see in downtown Cleveland.
Exactly. Well, in fact, Wilbur Cook, who was the general manager of the Wadsworth Brick and Tile Company at that time, he was a son-in-law to Schuyler Durling, who was executive vice president of the bank, donated bricks and supervised the construction of a artificial fireplace in the rooms, both at the bank or at City Hall, wherever it was being held, and they would make a very home-like setting. And this is kind of a jungle setting, I guess you'd say, or a garden setting. That's Mrs. J.L. Dickerson and Mrs. R.W. Hanchy, who are seated on a bench there in that particular garden. The next one we see is also from the 1939 garden show, and as I say, you just wish that they could be in color.
Color, right.
This is Mrs. Carl Gunderson. She was one of the chairwomen of the function and was examining some of the displays that they had there at that time.
Were these also for judging?
Yes. I don't know that it showed up on camera, but most of them had a little placard next to them giving a number of what contestants. And some people were known for growing a particular kind of flower or making a particular kind of arrangement. Now, we talked previously about some of the organizations that we had that were formed, that later formed the Federation of Women's Clubs. And these are just a few of the little booklets. At the beginning of each year, they would give to their members a little booklet, they continue to do so, that lists the different programs for the year and where the meeting will be held and who will be the hostess. The reason I pulled these out particularly, these are from the Cirrhosis Club. We showed some rather comic ones from the Cirrhosis last time, but I want to show that these three that you're showing, the first one was from the First World War.
Okay, I'll put this.
This one is from the First World War. From 1918, 1919, and you see it has a patriotic motif with the ribbon on the side. And the next one, I believe, is 43, 44, again with the shield with the national colors on it. And so I didn't want people to think that these were totally frivolous clubs. They were very serious in their studies. And the book reviews and the biographies and the studies that they would do of different countries were quite important. This is Cirrhosis from 42 and 43, but you see they carried through. Now this one I put in just because I think
I'm looking at the monitor.
It's kind of different. It's quilted linen.
Yes, it's very pretty.
And this is Cirrhosis 1969 and 70, and it shows the same type of thing. And the one behind is now.
Thank you.
It's hard for you to see, but it opens up, stretches out. This is Art and History.
Okay.
And it's 19, can you see on the front there, 1914, 15. And you can't really read it on camera, but they give a directory of their members, their honorary members, officers, and then they began their studies with Spain and then France, and they would have people assigned to give reports on different aspects of these different countries. Particularly during the war years, they would look into the political aspects of the wars. It was not just like a travelogue series. They were women who strove to improve themselves through sharing information with one another, as they continue to do today.
Right, more of an intellectual pursuit, really.
Exactly. And the same can be true of literature and the arts. The Child Study Group that we mentioned before, and Parma New, all of these groups that formed the Federation of Women's Clubs, that, as we said the last time we were together, tended to fall off in influence, and in the 1950s a separate Women's Club of Wadsworth was organized, and these other organizations tend to go along more or less independently. When we were speaking of the Garden Club of Wadsworth still is quite active, of course, as our oldest garden club, but there are also 3 other garden clubs. We have the Bud and Bloom, the Clearview Acres, and the Four Seasons garden clubs that operate here in Wadsworth. Now,
Which direction to go now?
I tell you, I'm just looking to make sure we're on track, and it amazes me when we are. We showed the Lions Club earlier with Charlie Bixler and the others being arrested. Well, I guess singing is in their blood, so they're a very social organization. I mean, that's not what I mean to say. Benevolent organization. They do so much good in their site program and things of that nature, but they do enjoy a good time also. And this is the Lions Club Quartet from probably late 20s, very early 30s. Now, you're going to tell me there are 5 people in the picture.
I was going to tell you that, and I thought, well...
If I wasn't going to mention it, you weren't.
That's right, I'm just going to pretend.
On the left, it almost becomes a family affair, because on the left we have Dave Straighton, Jr. In the Campfire Girls picture, we saw his wife, Marguerite Kramer Straighton. Next to him is his brother, Bill Straighton, who's also called Will Straighton. Next to him is R.W., or Bill Simister, who was Secretary-Treasurer of the Match Company. Next to him is his brother, Harry Simister. And the gentleman on the end is Johnny Harper, who was their pianist.
Okay. You've cleared your name now.
Now, one of the other women's organizations that we talked about that made up that Federation of Women's Clubs was the FPA, the Followers of Pallas Athene, 40 Pretty Angels. And they remain our oldest civic organization in Wadsworth. And unfortunately, I don't have a good picture, but that is a newspaper clipping of the officers and members of the club as they met on their 50th anniversary, which would have been in 1946. And you see they're wearing the dress or the garb of the time when the club was founded in 1896.
We have other pictures of them here?
Well, now, see how well they come up. This is also the FPA. And I thought, your hair always looks so nice and it's always in place. I thought you might want to try one of these different hairstyles, though.
I dare say they may have nets over those.
Well, that's the Marcelled hairstyle of the day, and those are the officers of the FPA in the 1930s.
We have liquid hairspray nowadays.
Now, we have had other organizations that have come and gone during this time. One of them was the Prosperity Club, which was started by Tony Michael from the Wadsworth Banner Press, about whom we've spoken previously. And the idea of the Prosperity Club, if I tell you it was started in 1934, it would probably give you the idea that this had something to do with the Depression. And the idea was to have money or vouchers issued by different merchants in town that could be given out for certain works that were done, and then these could be redeemed at the merchants, with the idea hopefully that if they went in and used these to redeem one thing, you would buy something else also, and it would help stimulate the economy in that way. Also during this time, one of the older groups that no longer functions in Wadsworth, it did until a few years ago, but that we didn't mention previously was when we were talking about the Knights of Pythias and the Patriotic Order of the Sons of America and the Modern Woodmen and all those, were the Dames of Malta, which were also a very influential and active organization in Wadsworth. They were a very conservative-leaning group, but as with a lot of these clubs, the members became older, and as a result, were not able to attend meetings, and the activities in the club drifted off. After the Second World War, though, when we had a lot of men coming home from the service, starting families, a lot of new organizations blossomed in town. And what may not sound like a new organization, but it was, in 1948, was the Grandmothers Club. And this was organized in that year Wadsworth chapter number 40, the Grandmothers Club, which is still very active. This is their organizational picture, and in the center, the first row, is Mrs. Walter Rockwell, who was the first president of that organization. And then, as we can see by this newspaper clipping, they were still functioning as they approached their 20th anniversary in 1967. And as someone who's had the pleasure of enjoying their hospitality and their culinary talents, I can tell you that the Grandmothers Club in Wadsworth is still very active after 45 years. They actually celebrated their 45th anniversary in March, and they meet at our Civic Center here in town.
I always like to float in the Blue Tip Parade.
Well, and the thing that, as a child who had no particular athletic prowess, the thing when we would go to the Wadsworth Week carnivals, the Grandmothers Club always had the little simple little things that you could do. You pick up the plastic fish or something and win a prize. And, oh, I was thrilled. I was
Self-esteem builder.
I tell you. Now, this is just another clipping. This is from the a story honoring Della Freeborn, who at that time, as you can see by the headline, was 96 and was a member of the Garden Club of Wadsworth that we talked about a moment ago. And Miss Freeborn is receiving a corsage that's being pinned on her by Arlene Baker, who was another member of that organization.
Okay, another one here.
And that's another picture of the Garden Club. Now, that's going back a little bit older. After the Second World War, when they decided that Wadsworth was just an old hick town, if you remember from World War I where they said, how are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris? It was that same type of thing where a lot of Victorian aspects of the architecture downtown were removed or covered up with plastic. Our stone bandstand was torn down. The statue of the Civil War soldier was moved to the cemetery, as was the Spanish War monument at the east end of the park. The park was narrowed by 16 feet. It was cut down on either side, and originally the Broad Street Park extended nearly to Lyman Street, and it was cut back. And the College Street Park was all but eliminated, and changes were also made in the High Street Park. Main Street never had a park. But the Women's Club were very active in trying to beautify what remained of these grassy areas. While we're talking about that Broad Street Park, we might remember that that is part of the original grant from Judge Frederick Brown, the original settler in the downtown area of the village, and was the parade ground where Wadsworth's first militia used to parade with broomsticks and just about anything else they could find. But this is the group of women as they're going over some of the plans that were designed by Dina Kreider, landscaper here in town, to beautify that downtown area. And of course the women are still very active in that pursuit.
In spring it's so nice to see the beautiful flowers that they've planted.
Now, this is a little bit out of place, but I'll go back to it. We saw earlier the 1914-15 program of the Art and History Club, and as you see here, the headline says, Club has 64-year tradition in reading, reviewing, and learning, and that pretty well spells out what they were doing. This is a gift selection committee. At the time of the bicentennial of the United States, this committee got together to try and decide what would be their gift, their lasting gift to Wadsworth. And on the left is Jean Jones and Daphne Jennings and Persis Snoke on the right. And as we saw in our last program, they decided that that gift would be a rendering of a composite drawing of our various churches in Wadsworth, which was done by the Lawrences and is now in the possession of the library. I think we want that one.
Right, I know we do.
And
right now?
But I think we may have lost a few.
Oh, I'll check through here. I think this was the last one. We did these with the flowers.
Yes.
Well, it'll come. It'll appear.
We will see. Well, we'll just move along with something else in that case. We talked previously, and this is another mistake that we need to rectify, that I need to rectify. This is a little program. We showed the ones from the different women's organizations that would spell out when the meetings would be held throughout the year. This one is from the Eaton Post, 265 of the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic, the Civil War Veterans. And it has a very attractive cover, and on the inside it lists the officers and the dates of the meeting and the members. And on the back it has a picture of the post commander, J.D. Reimer. The correction I need to make, and it's one of those things that when we're filming, sometimes as soon as you say something, you know it's not quite right, but you don't stop. And I mentioned that our Eaton post was named after Corporal Jackson Eaton. He had enlisted in June of 1861 in the Civil War and was killed, and I accidentally said, or misspoke and said that he was killed at the Battle of Chancellorsville, and we know better. He was killed at the Battle of Antietam. Now, they also had their Ladies Auxiliary, which was still a very influential organization in town, and this is the bylaws of the Women's Relief Corps, 191, which was the adjunct or the auxiliary to the Grand Army of the Republic. And this is, I believe, 1888. Yes, this is 1888. It lists their different bylaws.
Yeah. Nice little booklet.
It really is, and the chance of finding something like that.
I would have tossed this out that year.
Well, you would think you would get the new one, and so you're really pretty fortunate if you run across something like that. I know there are more.
Shall we?
Yep, go ahead. I see them now. They were buried. We just saw from the Civil War, we talked previously about the American Legion, which had been founded in Fred Falk's shoe store in 1919, and the VFW. This is a picture of the VFW, Wadsworth Post 1089, and they're involved in one of their recreational pursuits. To be quite honest, I'm not sure what they're doing. They're at a table, and there's a large crowd behind. I would guess that it's some type of athletic event that they're judging,
right,
some type of a race or competition that they're sponsoring. But these veterans organizations not only did things like the fun things like that, but they were also very active in more serious pursuits. And of course, after the First World War, we had a large influx of foreign people to Wadsworth to work in the Ohio companies, though many had come before, as my family had before the turn of the century. But the American Legion organized what were called Americanization classes, and these were under the direction of Marguerite Kramer Straighton in the background, the same little girl with the arrow, and Amaretta Yockey, who was a school teacher in Wadsworth, and Ethel Sinks in the back row. And this was in December of 1931, and it's a photograph of the children who put on at the end of the year, they put on a play for their parents. And the purpose of these classes was to help the foreign-born assimilate into American society, something that doesn't seem to be so encouraged nowadays, and also to prepare them for their citizenship papers, to take their citizenship tests so they could become American citizens, which as World War II darkened on the horizon, it became increasingly important that these people have American citizenship.
Mm-hmm. I've noticed that a lot of these organizations did things that now we require the schools to do. These individual organizations took it upon themselves to educate the foreign-born.
Well, exactly, and just like much of the charity work that was once taken on by these type of groups. Wadsworth used to, if you're a Monopoly player, you have community chest. Well, Wadsworth had a community chest which worked towards these ends. Money was allocated to people in need, and it was more an idea of you take care of your own. The Screen Actors Guild in Hollywood, they have their motion picture country home, which is totally funded by the actors and actresses, and that's where those who have served in their profession and perhaps are ill or have fallen on hard times are taken care of in comfort in their last years. And their slogan is, "We take care of our own." And I think if we all adopted that in our country, we'd be a lot better off. Continuing though with the Lions, this is back to the Lions Club. And I'm not sure how we did that, but we're back to the Lions Club again. And in 1944, under the direction of Homer Everhart as president of the Lions Club, they were trying to find a place to locate a recreation building here in Wadsworth. There was no set place where the young people could go for recreation. Now, the swimming pool, after years and years of haggling, had finally been built, but there was no set place for indoor recreation. And one of the places that was seriously considered was the Ross Trump home on High Street across from the present medical center, which is now the Mrs. Carl Schaefer residence. And as I think back on it, and the idea of people roller skating in the halls in that beautiful Georgian home, but the idea was that it was a lot of acreage in the center of a city, and they were going to chop up the rooms and make them into rooms for recreation. Fortunately, the Lions Club came to the rescue, and bought the old Masonic Temple. We had said that the Masons had met in the south half of the Oddfellows building on Main Street. In 1923, they built the building that we saw on the corner of King and High Street. During the Depression, the building went into receivership, and the Masons returned to the Oddfellows building, where they remained until building their new building on North High Street. And so the Lions led the fundraiser in 1944 to purchase this building and turn it over to the city for a recreation building. This is a picture of the Lions members tearing down the for sale or lease sign in front of the building. And besides that recreation center, they had been active previous to that in the establishment of a playground in Durling Park. Now, we've talked before when we visited Durling Park that that was a gift to the Durling heirs after Highland Avenue had been allotted and Woodland Avenue and Lower Crestwood had been allotted. This area was reserved for parkland with the idea that it always carried the Durling name. But no money was really set aside to do anything about establishing it or fixing it up as a park. And so the Lions Club took this on as a project, and you can see some playground equipment in the center there. And they also built the shelter house, which is in the park. And as you recall, a couple of years ago, the shelter house was burned and has now been replaced with a near replica of the original one. But as much as we disdain that type of behavior, that type of vandalism, this is a paper from June 19th, 1930. And this column over here is headlined, "Plan Better Local Jail," which, of course, was something we saw in the paper just a couple of weeks ago.
Right.
But on one of the topics that was mentioned at that council meeting was the destruction in Durling Park to the stands and the trees and the shrubbery and the play equipment there. So even almost 65 years ago, they had that same type of problem with vandalism. Hopefully we won't see it repeat itself. Now, we mentioned the Masons going down to their, moving back into the Oddfellows building. This is a picture of the past masters when they were still in the building that we would call the Center for Older Adults or the Civic Center, in their lodge room. And this is shortly after they opened that building, and they had all the past masters that were available get together to have their photograph taken. And in the front is Dr. C.A. Bullock and Professor Frank Lytle and Lloyd Hartzell over here on the right, and Ian Geisinger. And in the background is Brown Schrader and Joe Cahoon, who served many terms as master of the lodge, O.C. Nicodemus, Dr. Kramer with his silk top hat. On the right is L.E. Parker. We've seen many films that were made by his son Stanley Parker. Next to him is A.A. Cahoon, who was the father of Joe Cahoon and also served several times as master. Next to him is A.W. Wolfe, and on the right is Willard Cox. But they had all gotten together to have I guess you'd say, a group picture for historical purposes. And luckily that comes down to us.
Or you.
Now, the next picture that we have, the Masons are joined by the Eastern Star in their practices, and this is an Eastern Star comedy presentation that was done in October of 1927. And this was a play that they put on at the Central Auditorium. And seated in the front is Don Parmalee and Phyllis Williams and Ross Shank. And next to him is Rosalie Schaefer and Frances Bullock in the back holding little Pauline Shank Nullis. And on the right-hand side is Mrs. Ralph Rose. And in the back is Harold Huttenhauer and Mrs. Arthur Holben, who many people remember, Edna Holben, who clerked for many years in the IGA store. And next to her is William Raker and Mrs. Frank Urban and Charlie Bixler, the undertaker who we saw in the Lions Club pictures earlier, and Verna Crickbaum, who was later Mrs. David Gaston, and both she and Dave Gaston were for many years secretary and clerk of the cemetery board here in Wadsworth. And next to her, Lou Geisinger, and on the end, Mrs. Sid Smith. But that was done in 1927 as a fundraiser for the Eastern Star organization. And just a couple little booklets that we have here. I have from the Order of the Eastern Star, and I don't pretend to know enough about the organization to speak on it intelligently. as I'm sure will be pointed out to me, but on the right is many people remember Forey Wright, who was for many years a car dealer in Wadsworth. Wright Drive, next to the Central Middle School, is named in his honor, and this was his Masonic Bible.
This is the Eastern Star.
Right. Just a few more little artifacts of our community. As I mentioned, they moved up to High Street.
Can I open it here?
I was just trying to straighten that out, but it's not necessary, I suppose. They moved up to High Street into a brand new building that was built by labor done by the members of the organization. And in 1957, they celebrated their 90th anniversary. Now, backing up just a second, as we talked in our last show, they had actually begun in the 1820s, but had allowed their charter to go to Seville and then reorganized in the 1860s. So that's why there's a difference in the age of the organization. How are we doing?
Not too bad, right?
Oh, well, I don't know.
Can't slight anyone, though, now, you know.
No, well, that's the thing. That's the thing. When we did this photographic history of Wadsworth here in 1989, we had certain space constraints because of time and cost. And as I explained, I said, who are you going to leave out? The Republicans or the Democrats? The Lutherans or the Baptists? I don't want.
Well, you just keep doing other shows. See, that's how you get around.
I don't want to be responsible for making that particular decision. Oh, I am glad you said that, because we've been through the YMCA and we've been through the Campfire Girls. If I leave out the Girl Scouts,
that's right. This must be
the bottom
photograph
of this one. Those are the Girl Scouts in June of 1937. And on the left is Mrs. Wynne Davis, and next to her, Julia Davis, as she was known. And next to her is Helen Davis and Betty Maitland and Patsy Simister and Louise Fail, and Janet Hackenberg and Ruth Weinsheimer and Barb Durling and Juanita Wuchter. And they had just received pins for some of the work that they were doing in the scouting program. Now, this also brings to mind the fact that the Girl Scout Lodge at Camp Crag was another example of the benevolences of Dr. and Mrs. Eberhard. That's one of the things that they had donated also. Now, it amazes me when we're actually almost on schedule. I don't know what to do with myself. As I mentioned, we had a lot of these different organizations that started after the servicemen returned from World War II. And one of these organizations that we had were the JCs. And this is their charter presentation program from 1951.
Velvet.
A little velvety program there. And the first president locally of the JC's organization was Dr. Amos Bernard, the father of Dr. Gary Bernard here in Wadsworth. And I think there were about 28 members, I think I counted earlier. But this was the program that they had when they received their charter. And they were active in Wadsworth, quite active for a number of years, and then they took a slight hiatus, then became active again. There was an attempt to reestablish them, which was not real successful, and at the moment they are not active. But they've certainly contributed a lot to our community, as did the Wadsworth City Club, which was very active, the Gyro Club, the Fifth Wheel Club. There are all sorts of organizations that, as I say, somebody could find their little niche wherever they needed to belong, and it was not unusual for people to belong to 2 or 3 different organizations. And a lot of the growth that we saw after the Second World War, when a lot of the, what you might call movers and shakers of the community were getting on in years, and though they were interested in what was happening, were not able to take such an active role, a lot of these young men and women coming to the community really helped to boost us. Am I missing something? We're here having this time of year, we're coming up on, we can go to that one.
Okay.
You know, people don't, when I sit at home and I push all this into my computer and push the button and this comes out, people must think that this doesn't require any work. The top picture that we see is of Eleanor Eiler Shapiro, Wadsworth historian, who wrote the book Wadsworth Heritage in conjunction with our 150th anniversary in 1964. But this goes back a step further to 1938, when as the head of the English departments of the Wadsworth High School, she gave a writing assignment that they should write something about the history of Wadsworth, and they were to go out, the students, and interview people within the community. And they came back with such a wealth of information that under the sponsorship of Nellie Harder, who underwrote the entire cost of the publication, the book Wadsworth Center to City was printed. And we mention this frequently, and I think it's worthy of frequent mention because it's a wonderful source of information. A lot of this information that they gathered together would not be available to us had they not done so. And I don't know of another town of Wadsworth size during those days where the school students put out such a book. But that was printed 55 years ago, this spring, this month in fact. The cost of the book was $1 softbound and $1.50 hardbound, and that was delivered to your home. As I mentioned, the young people gathered a great deal of information, much beyond what could even be used in the book. And so this was all carefully stored away with surplus copies of the book. And when they did renovation to Central School a few years ago, they evidently threw them all out. Also at this time of year, we look towards the prom, and that's our next picture down.
Okay.
That's the 1938 prom. I don't know if we can come in any closer on that or not.
I don't think so.
The king is John Lucas, and his queen is Virginia Groman. And then you have attendants. On the right-hand side is Ed Bates.
Oh.
And on the right is Mary Ellen Overholt. And then over here on the left-hand side is Shirley Bachman and Carlisle Freeborn. And they had as the theme for that prom, there was a nautical theme, and they had to cross a gangplank to get to the dance floor and so forth, and that's why the attendants are dressed in sailor-type clothes.
And the hat. You remind me of New Year's Eve.
Exactly. We'll put this up again. We've used this photograph many times, but it does go along because this also is from the 1938 junior-senior prom. And it's coincidental to me because unfortunately with all the research I do, and I look and look and look for things and sometimes never find them, and then something will come along quite by coincidence, and it always amazes me. But this is a picture of the dance floor at that time, at that prom, and it was the only official picture taken on the dance floor. And it shows three couples in the front dancing, enjoying, looking forward to their futures as young people. On the left is Dick Bernard, and in the center is Jack Russell, and on the right, just almost out of the frame, is Don Simister. And all three of these men would go into service in World War II, and all three would be killed in action.
Oh, my.
So we always think when we're that age we're going to live forever, and hopefully we will, but sometimes it doesn't work out that way. Also at the end here, the bottom picture, this is Memorial Day, 1938, and the band has just gotten their new uniforms and are all lined up in front of the old stone bandstand. You see Wadsworth City Band. It's under the direction of Dallas Trent, and they're posing in their new uniforms before the parade starts off that Memorial Day 55 years ago this month. And I hope people will be present for our Memorial Day services this year and give our veterans, living and dead, the respect that they deserve. This is, I can just put this up just because it happens to be there. This is a newspaper from April of 1940. And this is our last Civil War veteran. We saw the GAR a moment ago. This is our last Civil War veteran, Clinton D. Waffle. And the headline says, "Tap sounded for last Civil War veteran." And he was 94. He's entombed in our mausoleum in the Woodlawn Cemetery. On a little bit of a lighter note, "City Remains on Wartime" was the headline of that paper. This is 1943. 50 years ago this year. But the big news for most people was the basketball team over here. Victory is the motto of the Grizzly Five. And they had already played 16 games, 16 matches, and they had only lost one. You want to guess to whom?
No.
Barberton.
Oh.
Kind of figures somehow. They only had one game to play yet against Akron South for the tournament. But on the left-hand side, we have Ray Willis, Stanley Price, and Paul Potter, and Don Slaughter over here, and Lee Kahn, and Jackson Hall, who of course is now our city treasurer, and missing from that picture are Charles Dancy and Ed Ruck. But that was 50 years ago this spring that group represented Wadsworth on the basketball courts. I want to say quickly that we got, since we filmed our last show, I've been the recipient of 2 wonderful gifts. And this is where I point out again that it doesn't matter if you have one thing or 1,000 things. The first thing came to me, it's just one item. The second is an entire collection that I've not even been able to move the entire collection yet, of clothing and photographs and all sorts of things that we'll be using these on future shows and talk more about them. But it doesn't matter, the thing that you might have that you feel is insignificant or of no particular consequence is what really might answer a lot of our historical questions and be invaluable for generations to come. I will say that neither of these items or neither of these gifts came as a result of my shameless plea on the last show. So therefore, I have no compunction whatever about putting up again the list of yearbooks that we need. Now, I receive the inquiries from the library, from the Chamber of Commerce, and from City Hall, as well as people who call me directly, and am responsible for answering all of these, and it is certainly a help to me if I have the reference sources at hand. And so if anyone has any of these missing volumes of the Wadsworth High School yearbook, or of any other Wadsworth items that they would like to add to the collection, I would be certainly happy to hear from them.
I think some people are under the assumption that you are funded somehow through the city, and that certainly is not true. This is a personal interest. More than an interest, I think this is a personal passion of yours to become involved in Wadsworth history. And I think people need to know that, the things that come your way are things that are not, given with a stipend for you to research too. This is something personal. Well,
and in many cases, the restoration and the preservation and storage of these items requires an outlay of funds from my own pocket. And so you end up operating in the hole because, as I pointed out before, I don't sell anything that I receive from Wadsworth, anything pertaining to Wadsworth. It's not a money-making proposition. The idea is that we will once again have a museum like the Woolbaugh collection that we gave away, and we'll be able to display these items for the education and entertainment of future generations. And they could probably put me in a little corner. Captain Woolbaugh in his museum, among the curios that he had, and he had hundreds and hundreds of items plus all of his thousands of photographs. And the one item that is most often mentioned by school children who went through his museum back in the teens and 20s was his boa constrictor. Because in the corner he had coiled up a boa constrictor. And most people in this area are familiar with Captain Martin Van Buren Bates, the Seville giant. And Captain Bates, this boa constrictor somehow got into his barn and choked to death on a horse blanket that it tried to swallow and couldn't digest. And somehow Captain Woolbaugh ended up with, of course he was a friend of Captain Bates, and ended up with this boa constrictor which he kept coiled up in his gallery. But it's interesting to me that that's one thing that stands out in people's minds after all these years. That and the guns. The boys particularly loved all the guns that he had, and he had guns representative of all the different battles, going back to the musket loaders of the Revolution, all the way up to his time in the First World War. And through the years, these were all vandalized and stolen, and much of his collection was stolen. So I've taken certain precautions to make sure that what we have here remains here, but it is helpful if people who have these things will come forward.
Maybe with spring cleaning this year.
Yeah, that's the perfect time to do it. And in fact, a woman from whom I received some items yesterday said, she was so glad to get these things out of her house. I said, you should come home with me when I get
your
there.
Mother, right?
and see the response I get when I walk in the door with these things. But they were wonderful things, and we hope that we'll have a lot more things to share in the future.
Okay. We were going to end up with
Oh, yes.
a couple more things, I know.
Well, at least...
Keeping with summertime approaching,
I think this... It amazes me when we actually mention everything and get everything done.
Oh,
This is just a picture. Last time we ended with a springtime picture of the fountain, of the boy with the boot in the park. And this, surprisingly, is now history. This is the old Grandview pool. And originally, they had all sorts of different schemes to build a pool in Wadsworth, and they couldn't agree on anything. One was even supposed to be a beach-like affair with some type of tower in the center, and then you could go down in and watch people swim underwater, and it played music or something. Of course, it was never built. But finally, this was built by the Bince Pool Company, and it was an elevated pool, meaning that you went in and had to go upstairs to get to the swimming area, and it was elevated above Grandview by the ball field, and provided recreation for Wadsworth young people for many, many years, almost 40 years, until the Steiner Center, the beautiful Steiner Center, was built. But this is a group of young people in the 1940s availing themselves of the recreation. Right. Hopefully we'll have an opportunity to do that before the weather, before it gets too much farther along.
Yeah. We have a clip too, don't we, Justin?
Yes, we do. Boy, I'm glad you're on top of things today.
Thank you for watching and talking.
I'm sorry, I was just going to say, we're talking about clubs and organizations. What we are going to see is a clip of the Knights of Columbus, which is, though a religious organization, is also very active in charitable work, and they are leading the parade into the Sacred Heart Roman Catholic Church on Broad Street as that congregation celebrates its 50th anniversary. They are followed by the band and by the officials of the church, led by Bishop Schrems and other dignitaries of the congregation as they're going into the church.
Okay. Thank you.